the EscapeGoat podcast, a podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Blake Fagiani, and several different guests. Welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 13, which we've somehow reached. And I'd like to welcome back one of the guests that we had on in sort of early to mid-April on episode 4, Olivia Broom. Welcome back.
Hey, I'm so happy to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, how's it going? You all right?
Yeah, it's good. It's good. It's mid-August and it's really fucking hot outside.
It's very, very warm. We've got like slight fan relief going in our respective rooms, but it's for the sake of sound quality, the windows are shut. You know, the curtains are pulled.
Dedication to the art.
Definitely, above and beyond, I'd say. How's it been coping with your sort of increased level of global fame since episode 4? Has that been all right?
Oh man, I mean, you know, since you put my details in the end of that podcast, I just had like no end of Instagram followers. Well, no, it's just kidding.
Yeah,
nobody yet. But soon,
no one's come.
After, no one yet. But after this one, it's going to be a whole load of new fans. So
that's the spirit.
It's all good.
I like it. I like the optimism. I've asked Olivia to join me today because we thought it'd be a good idea, or at least a fun idea, to talk about not just or sort of parallel passions of ours, really, in a way which will hopefully become clear, but also something that's something we were both into at probably kind of equivalent stages of our childhood, and something that's probably also helped us get through this very unusual 2020 that we've had. You know, the privations of lockdown basically help keep us a little bit sane by revisiting, and that is we're going to talk about the very well-known cultural phenomenon of Pokemon, but more specifically Olivia's personal relationship and involvement in it, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about one of my equivalent hobbies, but we'll get to that in the second half of the podcast. So firstly, Olivia, I just wanted to say, how did you first personally run across the sort of world of Pokemon?
So I've made quite a lot of notes about this because the more I was writing about it, the more I realised how fucking fanatical I've been about Pokemon the whole of my life. I think it started really as one of those, you know, like playground fads, and no one really knows like who brought the first card to the playground, or then where it went from there. But someone gets a shiny thing, and then you can get a shiny thing that's like different to theirs, and then you're like, oh, I want yours. Can I trade it with you, or can we swap or something? And then like I guess parents get wind of this because kids are like, oh, mummy, I really want some Pokemon cards, and you know, it escalates from there. You get some pocket money, whatever, and buy it. So definitely from primary school, when card collecting was a thing. I think that was the first starting point. But then I got given a kind of like, I'm not sure if it's called like a Battle Academy set or something, but it was like a big box with a whole load of like pre-selected cards and a huge kind of layout map that you could set down almost like Hearthstone. You could kind of like battle them. You'd have your deck, and you'd play with one other person, and you could use the stock that they gave you as kind of like a starter to the Pokemon Battles of Card game. So that's what my brother and I used to use. But that didn't really kind of like appeal to me as much because it was more about the battling and I was more about the cards at the time. Then I eventually got like a Game Boy Color, and my brother and I, luckily the two siblings only, had either one of the first Pokemon games. So I had Red and he had Blue, and I think this was like 1999. And so my first starter Pokemon was Charmander, and quickly evolved into a Charizard, and I just rapidly became obsessed with all of it, really. It's just an unbelievable world of journeys and making new kind of animal friends and walking around. It was just kind of just really captivating, and there's a huge reason why it's so popular.
And you came to it through some of the sort of what you might call the orbital materials, didn't you? Like, you know, you came to it through the trading cards and these sort of ancillary games, whereas, you know, arguably the core of the franchise, at least certainly the originator, is the, you know, the Game Boy video game. But like it's hard to overemphasize. I mean, it's never gone away as a cultural phenomenon. You know, you've literally got kind of bits, you know, sections of theme parks dedicated to it now, haven't you? But it's, as well as, you know, I think over 20 movies now, I think, you know, in various stages of digital release and cinema release and stuff. But yeah, it was just absolutely everywhere at the tail end of the 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. And I remember, I think I turned on the TV and I had like Swiss cable TV. I turned on at like 7 p.m. or something and I was like, oh my God, Pokemon is on TV. And I was like, whoa. And I was like, okay, remember what time it is and run to the clock and like look at it. It was like 7 p.m. Okay, it's going to be on every night. So I remember remembering that as a kid and being like, oh, I need to watch this forever onwards. So yeah, that was my first kind of initiation to it in primary school. And then after that, I think in 2001, so maybe like when it came out in the EU, I got Silver, which is the Generation 2. And I have a really fond memory of this because I was in New York and we'd gone to a toy store and my parents had bought the Silver and Gold games for my brother and I. And we were super jet lagged, so it was just like sitting in like a hotel in Times Square at 5 a.m, just playing, like starting the Pokemon adventure from scratch. And I was just like, yeah, this is even better than the holiday. I'm so excited. So
yeah, I think I had quite a lot of this is even better than the holiday moments as a kid, not particularly liking holidays.
Yeah, I mean, like the holiday to New York was fab, but like it was really exciting to go to a toy store and get it. So yeah, and I think it came out in the US before it came out in the UK or in Europe, so that was even better.
Yeah, it was a sort of staggered global release, wasn't it? I remember it being, because I was in the late 90s, I was a collector of N64 magazines, and that N64 gaming was kind of big what I was into. But I think I've mentioned this to you, but I remember getting sort of, you know, there'd be parts of those magazines that looked at the import scene, which was a much bigger part of it then, because, you know, releases were more globally staggered up till the early noughties probably. And I remember reading, you know, kind of half mystifiedly and half like amusedly about the kind of pocket monsters phenomenon. They always translated it, you know, thinking that that's probably what it ended up being called in Europe and the UK. But you know, sort of following that as basically a lot of the writers scoffed at it. You know, you'd have their one Japanese correspondent going, "No, it's really good, guys. It's gonna be massive," and they'd be like, "Yeah, sure, whatever."
Yeah,
you know, yeah, like that sumo game that came out last month. Yeah, sure. You know, so that was really fascinating to watch the juggernaut approach in that sense. It sounds like from the start, because for you it literally started kind of in the playground and, you know, through these social products, you know, like the trading cards and everything. It sounds like it's basically been quite a big social interaction from the start, you know, rather than a sort of more solitary pastime, although I'm sure it has been that too.
Yeah, I think it started mostly with like my brother and I and maybe some friends at the playground, but then I think people moved on quite quickly from Pokemon trading cards to, I think it was like Digimon next, and then it was like Beyblades and stuff, and it's like things moved quite fast in terms of children's trends, I guess. So it became more of a personal thing to me, I think, definitely towards when I started playing it on the Game Boy, because it was my adventure with my character that had my name on it and the Pokemon that I chose to come with me on that pursuit. So I think it definitely shifted from a social thing to more of like this is my journey. Yeah, it's a bit more solitary like that. In
terms of actual the video game itself, you know, it's starting with Pokemon Red and Blue, that generation. Like, what was your sort of like rough background with video games before that? Was that amongst the first games you played, or were you quite an experienced gamer already?
When did the PS1 come out? Because that's the first one I had, but do you know when that came out?
PS1, I guess if you got it as an early adopter, that probably would have come out like a good couple of years before that at least, I guess.
Okay, then yeah, I might have had that, but then I think I just got a Game Boy and it's a bit more like travel friendly. I think my dad had like the first big solid block Game Boy and he had Tetris and like Super Mario on it, and that was it. So he was like kind of happy to buy a Game Boy for my brother and I to use, because he'd owned one and he knew the joys of playing like the first Mario and Tetris, like, and that's all he had. That's, you know, he could like smash that out. Like, he always remembered where all of the hidden lifts and stuff were in Mario. So yeah, I think I had that. Had Game Boys for a little while. Then I got the XP. So I had like Sapphire was my next one. But then I kind of skipped a few generations. I don't know if I think I just like went to uni or just didn't really find the appeal for the in-between ones, or I got that kind of like fatigue that a lot of people get with like, oh well, there's a lot of Pokemon now, how am I gonna fucking catch them all at this rate?
Yeah, I mean these kind of like childhood fads that often evolve into lifelong fads, you do have like fallow periods, don't you? It doesn't mean you're done with the franchise or anything. It just means I'm exactly the same with Star Trek. You know, as I've mentioned to Isabel on a previous podcast, you know, there was basically about a decade where I didn't really care, you know, where I was certainly disengaged, you know, and it was still that sort of with Star Trek that coincided with kind of the closest it's had to a wilderness period in some ways, but also I'd faded out before then, you know, but then it's something I've revisited fruitfully in later life. So I mean, do you think Pokemon then, because I suppose Pokemon as a game and kind of as a franchise as well, it's sort of an RPG, isn't it? It's a very sort of basic collecting RPG. So was that your sort of first experience with that kind of game beyond just a simple sort of platform puzzle game, I guess?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of the games I had the PS1 were a bit more, not as like RPG, like free world kind of style adventure. So I never actually had any Zelda games, which is funny because a lot of people grew up with Zelda and Pokemon, and there's definitely a similarity between the styles of that. But I had a couple of like action fighting games that you could play with your friends. It was more like collaborative games that you could play with other people, because that's what PS1 was quite good for that growing up.
Yes, I suppose the Pokemon's probably, like, visually, in terms of its sort of like slight cutesiness and top-down look, at least in the classic games, it's kind of a fusion of that look and layout of Zelda, you know, and the exploratory aspect with the kind of basic battle mechanics of, you know, just to name the most famous example, Final Fantasy VII, you know, the turn-based RPG stuff, which obviously was always, well, was big from, like, you know, at least a decade before that in Japan, and that was one of the, I suppose, alongside things like Final Fantasy VII and VIII, it was one of the things that Pokemon popularized much more in the West. Yeah,
no, definitely. And I think it's less, I don't know if Zelda and like Final Fantasy are a bit more kind of battle focused, whereas Pokemon is like battle focused, but also it's like a collection thing. You can go around, you can talk to people, you can walk into people's houses, you can hang out, you know, there's so many more things to do than just kind of fighting your way through this, I don't know, the adventure. But it's definitely just more, there's something for everybody, I think, in it. And it's obviously it's based on, like, we'll go into this, I guess, but it's based on real animals. It's also based on real myths. It's based on a whole load of stuff that people kind of can relate to. So yeah. And although we're using the term monsters, and we'll be talking more about that later in the podcast, the Pokemon were always kind of cutesy, weren't they? They were always kind of like very child friendly. You know, even the most fearsome of the Pokemon was, you know, not scary or anything like that. You know, not for most kids anyway. You know, no.
So it was very accessible in that sense.
Yeah, some of them do evolve to be pretty ugly or pretty fierce, but that's you get the kind of glory of choice. You know, you can choose a Pokemon that's going to be super cute for the rest of its life, or you can choose one that's going to grow up and really badass. So, you know, there's definitely a Pokemon for everyone, I think.
I mean, were you already a sort of like a big fan of animals and sort of, you know, collecting and learning about animals when you got into Pokemon?
Yeah, I've grown up with quite a lot of animals in my life. I've had dogs, chickens, rabbits. I grew up across the road from some lions and a tiger, so that was just like casual. So yeah, I like just casually dropping that. Just casually dropping that. But my room was always, you know, as a kid, you grow up like I had animal curtains and zoo toys and stuff like that. You know, you just have items around you that. So yeah, surrounded by animals and things, and I think just the idea that you can make up your own like monster and it just kind of exists in this world is really great. Like, I spent a lot of my time kind of trying to draw some of the Pokemon that I had as a card, because I thought like, wow, someone's drawn this, and I think that's fascinating, like all the different details on each Pokemon that makes them unique. And so I'd spend time like trying to redraw Pikachu or redraw some of my favorite ones from the cards, and I think it was really, like, artistically there's a lot of work that went into it. I remember doing the same thing with some video games I was into, but I can't draw very well, but I was kind of obsessed with charts and maps and sort of like categorizing things, you know, like a lot of nerdy kids. And my thing pictorially was I was always trying to take games that didn't really have world maps and trying to make them have world maps, things like the Sonic games, you know, where you just have zone after zone after zone after zone, not in a sort of linear way. I'd be taking them and I'd try to make them into sort of a feasible geography, and, you know, there's ridiculous sketches. Yeah, it's a fun undertaking. You know, it would help if your artistic ability met you halfway in terms of achieving things like that. But yeah, no, I had practice, mate.
Yeah, I'm still practicing. I just wanted to, before we talk a little bit more about what might make Pokemon, you know, the creatures and that kind of world so appealing and perhaps educational as well. I just wanted to ask you, because you mentioned you'd started off with Charmander in that first game that you'd engage with. Did you have like either quite a well-known Pokemon or a more obscure one that was your favourite, or did you have a few favourites? You know? Yeah,
I had a few favourites. One which is from the second generation in like Silver and Gold, which is called Ampharos, and it's kind of like a dinosaur electric version with a kind of sheepy face. If you don't know what it looks like, Google it. But that was my favourite.
Helpful for the listeners.
Put a link in the bio of whatever this is. So yeah, so I drew loads of Ampharos for a while, but I think one of my favourites, and I have a picture of me holding this Pokemon card with two others, is Ninetales, because Ninetales just looks beautiful and, I don't know, just really stunning and just really simple, but.
That was a sort of multi-tailed Firefox, wasn't it? I remember that one.
Yeah. A nine-tailed kind of white fire-type fox. So, yeah, that was also my favourite. But Ampharos is the one that I drew the most, and obviously Pikachu, iconically, everyone, you know, was drawing Pikachus. I actually made a Mew out of plasticine once, like a pink Mew after I went to go see the Pokemon film that came out.
Yes.
And then my friend squashed it. It was I was devastated. But
we all remember where we were when we heard about that.
Yeah, I could hear my tears from across the pond. So yeah, sad times.
I went to see the first Pokemon movie as well, because this is one of those things. My brother Matt, who's been on the podcast 3 times now.
Yeah.
He went to see it because this was exactly the point. I think for me, it was like in the tail end of the 90s and maybe the very beginning of the noughties, when, if anyone who has a younger sibling a few years apart, you get to the point where you're not really going to see kids' films anymore on your own bat. You're trying to act all grown up and, you're not as interested in them anymore, but you're still maybe basically partly babysitting, and you're kind of taking your younger sibling to see those things. So I think that, for me, that started with probably about Hercules in terms of Disney movies, and lasted for a few years into, things like Titan AE and things like that, but also the beginning of Matt's Pokemon phase, because I'd say I'm a tiny bit old, I'd say, to get into the sort of main Pokemon fad in a sort of playground sense, because I was kind of early high school, rather than late primary school or mid primary school. But Matt was dead on for it, so he had got a lot of the cards, he's still got a few tucked away in an album somewhere. He got really into it, so I ended up going to see that first movie, and was I'd already seen some of the cartoon show, so I'm not going to pretend I was more baffled than I was. But it was quite an odd cinema experience, probably a bit unlike one I've had since, really. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, there's a lot of things just flying around in the air. I can't remember it, what actually happened. I just remember being awestruck by it and be like, this is great. And they introduced the 2 legendary Pokemon, and you see them, and they're not like cards that you could ever get. I never had a Mew or a Mewtwo card, but yeah, it was a lot of fun, whatever happened.
You talked about how everyone liked Pikachu, and of course that was the direct result of a sort of marketing blitz focused around him, although I guess it was kind of a feedback loop. He was a popular Pokemon already in Japan, so he became the sort of launch backbone, I guess, of the US and UK markets. But it's funny, isn't it? We were discussing this the other day. Game Boy gamers will know that they released, shortly after, I guess, Red and Blue, they released Pokemon Yellow, which was interestingly sort of transmedia in a sense, wasn't it? Because it was an attempt to almost remake Pokemon, but more like the TV show, to sort of slightly reshape it so it played with more familiar tropes and starting points.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think I ever had Yellow, but I think a friend of mine did, and it's literally exactly the same game, except that Pikachu is following you around. So there wasn't really much appeal, because I already had the game, and I was like, well, I have all 6 of my Pokemon in my bag, I don't need one to follow me around. But interestingly, what has happened with the newest Pokemon generation, so the stuff for the Switch that's just come out, so Sword and Shield, is that Pokemon now kind of roam free, and you can see them physically in the park or wandering around, or you can have a choice to have Pokemon follow you in the expansion pack. So they have gone back to that kind of this is a world run by Pokemon, and we all just live here, kind of like how we currently live in nature and things, where on this planet, I suppose. So we all live here, but we don't own this land.
Oh, because I suppose it was always implied to be their world in a sense, wasn't it? Because even on the sort of old 8-bit top-down games, you're wandering through a landscape and encountering different Pokemon. But what you think there's actually been a sort of almost philosophical, very subtle philosophical shift in the games themselves? Do you think?
Yeah, I think they probably had to think of something new to do instead of being there's wild Pokemon in the grass. People got kind of tired of running into who knows what Pokemon. Whereas if you can run into Pokemon that you can see, so you can avoid them actively or catch them actively. But they're also question marks. So you go into the grass and you can see a question mark pop up, and you'll be like, oh, that's a rarer Pokemon, or Pokemon that I probably don't have. So it's a bit more helpful. It makes it easier for you to basically catch them all, because you know where to look, and depending on the weather as well, but I guess maybe it is a philosophical question around a bit more. Maybe they're making a comment about climate change, I don't know, or it's not our planet kind of thing, and we need to look after it, or something like that. Yeah,
well, possibly. I mean, I suppose going as far back as the N64, when you started to have games like Pokemon Stadium, which was kind of replicating the battle arenas but in 3D, for some of the monsters initially, and then all of them later. I actually played a fair bit of that.
Yeah, that weird hiatus with Pokemon Snap, which you just cruise around and take photos of Pokemon.
Yeah, I was going to. I never actually had that one, but it fascinated me just reading about it. But because it seemed to be essentially from the reviews, barely a game really, which is fine, because I played things like Pilot Wings, which has elements of that. Just chill back and relax and enjoy the graphics.
Exactly. Yeah, it's more of a idle game that you just kind of just cruise around, and you're on safari or in a dinghy or something, just snapping away.
Yeah,
I didn't own that either, but friends of mine did, and it was all right. But not as adventurous. As that's what I look for in a game, is the more adventure side.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's interesting in terms of game eras, isn't it? Because the late 90s was an era where a bunch of stuff with high-end PC and console graphics was developing. So you'd get like your Quakes and your Half-Lifes and Turok on the N64, and and the Tomb Raider games, and you'd get everything. Everything was going to 3D. Everything was becoming kind of for the time at least sort of stunning in terms of the way it was put across. Games, a big thing about games became their visual appeal and their sort of relative and increasing realism, whereas Pokemon is this hugely successful late 90s franchise launch, but in a way that already was, in terms of looks, was passé. So you've got this kind of weird transliteration of it into trying to make it look more akin to the avant-garde stuff that's stunning everyone else. But I think Pokemon players knew that wasn't the core of it. They were into this thing, and it wasn't because of the spectacle. It was because of their engagement with it and their involvement.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure when the shift really happened. Maybe it was around kind of like generation 5, 6, 7 or say, I want to say, where your character suddenly became a little bit more 3D, but it still wasn't kind of like 3D in a sense. It was like your character had a bit more definition to it, and buildings were 3D, and it was no longer kind of just pixels and black and white. I don't know if that was off-putting for a lot of people. It's definitely a shift in look and feel, which could have been a bit weird to a lot of people. And now obviously it's still kept that kind of thing, but it's much more like 360-degree angles on your character, and you can design your own character and things. It's definitely kept up with that paradigm.
And I want to talk to you in a little bit actually about you mentioned Pokemon Shield, which I think is the one you've got, isn't it, of the current generation.
Yep.
I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of almost like your review of that as a sort of story Pokemon player in a bit, because I know you recently got a Switch and you've been playing quite a lot of it. So I want to hear your take on that. Before we talk about that, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the Pokemon and I think specifically the way I, as a sort of more distant observer of the series, and someone who knows a fair bit about at least that first generation of Pokemon. One thing I was thinking about recently, because I was playing Pokemon Stadium a little bit last year because I've got an N64 lying about, and I was trying to get back into the sort of battle dynamic, and I was obviously realizing that I had to start remembering what elemental Pokemons worked effectively against the other Pokemon and how that all interacted. And I ended up, looking up like a chart, basically online. It was a ludicrously complicated chart, even for that first generation, sort of cross-referencing, types against other types. But then I was just thinking about it, and I was thinking, for someone like my young nephew, for example, he's just over 2. In a few years' time, it might actually end up being this really useful educational tool, as I'm sure it was for a lot of kids, maybe in that kind of 5 to 10 bracket, when you're learning basic science and basic science interactions. Because I was going a lot of the time I was consulting the chart, but then a lot of them I just didn't have to at all, not just because of memory, but also because I was like, well, water beats fire, electricity beats water. That seems to make sense, at least on a vulnerability level, and you kind of fire beats grass, that kind of thing. And it's interesting, isn't it? So I think that's something that helps a lot of fairly young or maybe inexperienced RPG kids get into that battle dynamic element, wasn't it? Because even if you pick that up when you are maybe only 7 years old, say 7, 8 years old, there's already a lot of basic understanding of the world that there's both the game's teaching you, but also your pre-existing knowledge is looping into the gameplay.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie, Pokemon Master that I am, I also still have to Google this all the time. Mostly because they've added so many different ones like Steel, Ghost, Fairy, and like Dragon and things since the original. And it gets a little bit more complicated, a little more convoluted, and there's more weaknesses to play with to different degrees. So it's not just like you're weak to that, you're strong to this. It's like you're kind of maybe weak a little bit to this one, but not in a critical way where you get like a critical hit. So yeah, it is quite hard to remember, but I agree. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's almost like chemistry of the world, isn't it? It's like the elements, and they do inherently make sense. I think like if you get Steel Pokemon, it's weak against fire, and you think, oh, okay, it's melting it down or something. And you get a Ghost Pokemon, which is I think it's weak to Fairy. Man, if I get this wrong, I'm going to be in so much trouble.
Yeah, I get them wrong all the time. Psychic, I never worked out what that was good or bad against,
Yeah, Psychic, I think, is just like only weak against itself, because I don't know, that makes sense somehow. But yeah,
yes.
it's really interesting how it does kind of make sense, and it is learnable, and it's an interesting kind of, maybe it helps people with the chemistry and learning about elements, and I don't know.
Yeah, I suppose in that sense it's almost like, and because I know it's about the interaction of matter as well as energy, and the porous line between them, at least as a child's understanding would have it. But in that sense, the Pokemon collectively are kind of like a beginner's periodic table, aren't they? Like, I mean, even the way that you catalogue them, you know, even in the way that there are, even just roughly the number of them, you know, in terms of the elements that kids then go on to become familiar with at high school. You know, it's kind of, and their interactions, because the periodic table is grouped into areas and groupings of elements which you know are going to have similar properties because they're in that same column. And, you know, obviously Pokemon are a slightly different beast from that, but it's got, again, I suppose it's just that we'll talk more about this, but it's just that nerdy innate thing in a lot of, I think most kids probably, really, that they want to understand the world from a fairly early age, however sort of traditionally academic they are, and they want to catalogue it to an extent. They want to collect it, they want to file the elements of it they understand away and learn more about the elements they don't, you know.
Yeah. I mean, your Pokedex is essentially like some sort of like electronic book that you just store all of the information in, right? And so you're journaling down all of the different discoveries that you've made that day, or, you know, whatever, akin to, you know, I guess Charles Darwin making notes about all the things he discovered when, you know, he was going around on his explorations or something. It's kind of similar, I guess. And yeah, the classification thing is really satisfying. I remember I got like the Pokemon like Pokedex card, and on the Pokedex itself it had the order of all of the energy types in sequence. So that's exactly how I ordered my Pokemon album, where I'd put my cards in. So it started with fire, it went on to like water or something, but I like made sure that I did that properly.
Yes,
and then it ended with the energies and ended with the items I don't really care about. But it's a beautiful rainbow of Pokemon cards, and it's very satisfying.
Yeah, I think the ordering of things makes a lot of. It's very important to you as a kid. I think any sort of collective-minded kid, arranging things, you know. And I suppose you were saying there that, you know, the Pokédex is this kind of, you know, bestiary basically that you're referring to, but I suppose you're pointing out the sort of. What would you call it? The symbiosis there of marketing in a way, aren't you? Because like the battle cards obviously come off the video game, and they are a thing that spurs the kids' desire to interact with that world and to collect and to socially interact. You know, right down to the slogan of "Got to catch 'em all." You know, it's an imperative.
Oh, it's very well done. I mean, you couldn't really fault it, can you? Like, just it just makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I definitely, and you know, we did our previous episode on South Park, didn't we, with Matt, and we it wasn't the main focus of it, but we touched on the Chim Pokemon episode from Series 3, and I definitely see why Matt Stone and Trey Parker, who tend to be a bit suspicious of corporations and their interactions with childhood, would be, you know, why they would be fairly cynical about the whole phenomenon.
Oh man, yeah, it's definitely like spot on their portrayal of like how catchy and just how like brainwashy Pokemon is to children, and how ridiculous the monsters are as well. But yeah, it's real Pokemon is better than that. It's got way more depth, man. Okay.
Yeah. Oh no, it certainly has. You know, I think the more outrageous extrusions of the franchise though are worth noting and ridiculous and appealing in their own right. And in fact, I'll probably drop into the show notes. I know I definitely will drop into the show notes that Lou Bega intro sequence that we've shared many times.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not even going to further describe that. That will be in the show notes for everyone to enjoy.
Yeah.
Great bit of corporate shilling. I know you've been looking into it a little bit, you know, in addition to your sort of inbuilt knowledge about Pokemon, not inbuilt, but, you know, story knowledge about Pokemon. But you were looking a little bit into the sort of Japanese cultural stuff behind some of the creatures and kind of the elemental side of them, and how some of the influences of Pokemon came together. Would you like to tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I was looking at a video yesterday, which is kind of like Japanese religion's influence on Pokemon, which is kind of along the lines of being influenced by two different types of like spirits / ghosts / monsters / demons. It's very hard to kind of describe the word accurately, but one is kind of like a spirit god that's kind of seen to be good, and one is kind of a spirit god that's seen to be bad. But it also depends on what your perception of these are. It's I mean, there's a whole load of stuff you go into it about it, but one's called kami and one's called yokai, and there's some sort of like anthropomorphic deities that exist in Japan.
So this is sort of broadly within the framework of sort of cultural Shintoism, is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, these kind of supernatural beings that either kind of are good or bad, but it's kind of how you see them that is basically how they're portrayed to you. So there were things that touched on that, which is basically there was like Drowsy, which is a Generation 1 Pokemon. It's kind of like a tapir-looking Hypnosis Dream Eater. That's based off an actual, I think it started in Chinese poetry and Chinese lore, and then moved to Japanese kind of culture as well, but more of like a dream-eating monster. So that was quite interesting. And then the second one was actually, like, going back to one of my favorites, Ninetales, is based off Kyuubi no Kitsune, which is basically the nine-tailed foxed kami / yokai. And there are loads of shrines where you can give, I think, like fried tofu to the foxes at the shrines, or like the fox statues, and you can. So there's a whole thing around that. So they actually, there is like a Ninetales influence on that one.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. So it's known that they like fried tofu.
Yeah, apparently. I don't know who told them which fox was like, "Psst, give me some tofu, man." But yeah. Apparently that's the thing. Yeah, definitely in the games, when I was kind of reflecting on the shrines that I'd seen in games, and all of the shrines kind of belong to ghosts. And I always remember in every game, you end up kind of climbing this dark tower, and there's loads of psychic Pokemon in there, or there's like a graveyard, and that's where you can find all of the ghost Pokemon. And definitely for the first 3 generations, and even in the expansion pack, there are these shrines, and legendary Pokemon live there, and ghosts live there, and yeah, there's always been that kind of factor to it of honouring supposedly dead Pokemon, although Pokemon never seem to die because they just faint and then they kind of get revived. So it's an interesting concept, if whether the Pokemon are dead or not.
I suppose that's the sort of sanitization, isn't it? Sort of a necessary sanitization for kids. I think I remember joking with some of the older kids who were sort of more cynical about Pokemon, that it was a really weird message for a game to have the purpose of life is to go around getting into fights so that you can evolve.
Yeah, like when you spell out Pokemon literally, it doesn't make any sense. It's kind of like, I think there was actually like PETA condemned Pokemon because it was like supporting cruelty to animals or something, essentially, in like 2012, and they were like, no, this is not good.
Well, at the very least, it's got some of the sort of questions baked into, if you were to take it at all seriously as a genre, it's got some of the questions baked into it that Star Wars kind of elides as well, isn't it? But more to do with the droids in that, where you kind of talk about them as property, but you never really get into that.
Yeah.
I know some Star Wars media recently has been exploring that a little bit more, and I'm sure that some of the spin-offs that were decades ago, but yeah, Pokemon is best served by not asking those questions too much, I think.
Yep.
It's interesting. I remember reading. I'll be misremembering this in some specifics, I'm sure, but I remember reading a few years ago about not just sort of perhaps the great sort of Japanese game designer of that era, Shigeru Miyamoto, but also Satoshi Tajiri. I think I'm saying that right. Is the Pokemon sort of the creator of Pokemon. I remember reading that they were both people who grew up in sort of Japanese cities. I think Tajiri grew up in Tokyo, but they visited the countryside frequently, with family members, and they were fascinated by nature, and they were allowed quite a lot of freedom to explore nature themselves. And this led to a lot of influence on the Mario, Zelda franchises in Miyamoto's case, but also obviously on Pokemon in Tajiri's case. And he used to, apparently one of his childhood nicknames was Dr. Bug. He wanted to become an entomologist, and he used to go around collecting creatures in little bottles and jars, and collecting them and comparing them. So you can definitely see, I mean, just on a sheer biographical level, you can see where some of the sort of id of the game comes from. It's just fascinating. But I suppose it's not to other it too much, but because obviously all sorts of cultural traditions have this interaction with the countryside, and creatures that either do literally dwell there, or that figuratively and symbolically could be seen to, the embodiments of nature. Because that's interesting, isn't it? Because we were talking about the elemental stuff before, but you get different types. The grass type Pokemon, for example, are literally kind of living hybrid plant animal beings. That's the way they're portrayed.
Yeah, definitely. And there's like bug Pokemon, and then you got like ice Pokemon, which are all kind of they're all kind of adapted to their environment. They're built to look like they could survive in whichever terrain they are given. And
you've got birds as well. You've got specific. I don't think we talked about this when we categorised them, but you've got flying attacks, haven't you? And you've got ground attacks, which have the invulnerabilities to each other. And
yeah, exactly.
It's very as you say, it's built to populate the environment, and also, I suppose, as well, educationally, to teach kids about the environment. I wanted to just briefly mention, because we sort of elided one of the key gameplay aspects apart from collecting, which is that the variety of Pokemon is amplified, isn't it, by the evolution thing, by the fact that you can get these Pokemon, like you referred to, was it Charmander as one of your starter Pokemon originally, and Charmander becomes, I'm going to get this wrong, I remember it becomes Charizard, but I know there's a stage in between there that I'm forgetting. What is that?
Oh, mate.
What is that? I could never remember that one. I've got Squirtle, Wartortle, Blastoise.
Testing me, man.
And I've got Bulbasaur, Venusaur. No, wait. Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, and Venusaur. Yeah. Still can't. Yeah. Don't know what it is. Gonna have to look that one up. Drop it in. If you for the rest of the podcast, if that comes back to you,
I'll just yell it
Yeah, just yell it at any point. I'm not even going to change where it comes.
It'll just appear out the Pokeball that I've got to hand, so it'll be great.
But I suppose the evolution thing is interesting, isn't it? But it also teaches kids about the relationships, and there's something very sort of child rote learning, isn't there? But also fun and kind of useful about learning that sequence of evolution and the amplification of the powers. And I suppose also you might say in a sort of teaching way, it's teaching kids the value of keeping at it, of perseverance, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see it as like almost like a metaphor for growing up. Like your Pokemon will be with you for a little while, and then it'll turn into something else, but it'll still be there. And then if it's got a third evolution, then it grows up again. And sometimes you may not want it to kind of evolve or grow up, but you're in two minds about it changing. But then it does eventually evolve, and you're really kind of proud that it's gotten bigger and more powerful, and it's doing more things, and it likes you more. And there's kind of like it's like a beautiful sadness of having a relationship with the Pokemon. And I think you can give it a thing called like an Everstone, and if you give it to the Pokemon, it will never evolve. So you can have a Pokemon forever. There is a little leeway with that. See what you will about the ethics of that. But
Kirsten Dunst interview with a vampire. This Pokemon will never grow up.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose we're both Doctor Who fans, aren't we? So I suppose we understand the sort of the melancholy, but hopefully enjoyment and excitement as well about things transmutating into new forms, but remaining essentially the same kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's fun to see that journey through the progression of the character of the person who's evolved, and how they've changed, and how they're inherently still the same person or thing or Pokemon, but they've just gotten bigger and better, and hopefully more exciting, and still your lifelong friend. Like Doctor Who kind of is. He's still changing, but he's still your friend forever, really, isn't he? He, she, it, eventually, who knows? Alien being,
Yeah, indeed, yeah. No, I think that's a great way to look at it. And I wanted to turn over the mic to you now, then, just to talk a little bit about your recent experiences, because I think you decided to bite the bullet and do what you've been thinking of for a while and buy a Switch. Was it about 2 months ago?
I think so. Yeah, about 2 months ago. Yeah,
and you got Pokemon Shield straight away with that, right? That was your launch game, basically.
Oh man, it was such a struggle to get a Switch in the first place. Like I held out because I was like, I'm not going to buy a Switch because it's quite a lot of money. So I held out for maybe a good 3 months, I think, until I bought one. And it was next to impossible to pre-order a Switch, because you just have to stick it on your wish list, and then you get an email from Nintendo saying this is now available. And the bundle for Pokemon was never back online. I think I had to get one with Mario Party on it just to get the Switch itself, because I didn't want a Switch Lite. I wanted the one which is more kind of multiplayer. Mm-hmm. So finally got the Switch itself, and the great thing about the Switch is you don't necessarily need a cartridge. It has its own memory, so I could just in 2 hours I downloaded Pokemon Shield, which was fantastic, and just in time for a holiday. And I spent a whole week just solidly playing through the adventure of Pokemon, and it's really phenomenal. Actually, the graphics are stunning, the scenes that you end up in are stunning, the camera movements are pretty amazing too, and just seeing the Pokemon roaming around and the landscape and just how they've engineered it is absolutely like breathtaking in certain places. I was really, really impressed, and obviously like all that nostalgia came flooding back. And during lockdown, you need a little escape, and an online escape is better than none. And so much so that some days I was playing Pokemon so much, and then went outside during lockdown for a little sit in the grass, and I was like, wow, this is really anticlimactic. The real world is not what it cracks up to be. It's kind of shit. But so back on the Switch I go. So no, it's fine. It's been an amazing thing to rediscover when I had some more kind of spare time, and when you needed a bit more kind of adventure and a bit more of something to do, really. And it's been fantastic. Yeah,
it sounds like it. I mean, you showed me a little bit of this. I was sort of looking at it over Olivia's shoulder a few weeks back, and it was because my use of the Switch is, I'm an old Nintendo kid, but I've only had to go on Mario Kart briefly due to my mate Johnny, which was great fun. Particularly as I had some of the N64 tracks that I remembered, which was helpful. Meant I didn't lose every single time. But you were showing me. Because me and historical context for whenever everyone's listening to this podcast, me and Olivia are still working from home because of coronavirus in 2020. We've been doing so in London. We both live in London. and we've obviously have experienced how different the city's been for this sort of early to middle part of the year in terms of it being deserted and us having very limited access to the centre where we before this worked. So that's been really strange. But you showed me that that Pokemon Shield and Sword use a lot of sort of British and specifically London imagery in the game, right?
Yeah, so if you actually go on I think it's the Wikipedia article for Pokemon Shields or Swords, it actually explains how it's based off Great Britain, which I didn't really realise in terms of the landmass, but when you look at it, it's basically the same shape when seen from kind of like above. And you start in this place, which is called the Slumbering Weald, and all of these names are kind of all, I don't know, there's a place called Galar, which is like kind of like Galahad, there's like Sir Chester, which is like a Bath-esque town, there's a place called like Ballonlea, which means like forest clearing, I think. And so all of these like words that they use for different towns are definitely based on the UK. You start in this kind of like little cottagey primeval forest space where your mum is, and then you go off, and eventually when you get all the way through, you end up in this city, which just made me laugh so hard because it was like literally just like it was just a spitting image of London with just added kind of Japanese metros, like looked like double-decker buses, and it had the London Eye, it has like Regent Street, it has like St Pancras, like King's Cross kind of station bit. It was just too much for me.
Yeah, quite an emotional time to explore a sort of parallel Britain in a way, wasn't
it? And the whole storyline basically follows this kind of, I don't know, King Arthur-esque journey where you're looking for these two wolves, and one has a sword kind of item and one has a kind of shield, and yeah, you basically end up, well, I don't know if this is a spoiler, but you basically end up finding them in this beautiful forest clearing with this like kind of like broken arch with like sun rays streaming through these kind of trees of this primeval forest, and it's gorgeous, but it's all like, it's very King Arthur-y, and you discover this big mural that falls down, and it's all...
That sounds pagan as fuck. And
yeah.
You mentioned Galahad before, chiming with the Arthurian stuff, but I guess with the two wolves, you've got the sort of Romulus and Remus echo as well. Isn't it?
Yeah. Some of the Pokemon, I think in the Shield version and the Sword version, there are Pokemon which are specific to that region. So I think this started a few generations ago, where you'd find Pokemon that only existed in like the Alohan area, they were kind of like vaguely Hawaiian themed Pokemon. So there'd be like
the Alohan. I see what they did there.
Yeah. They're pretty like tongue in cheek with some of these names, but so you'd get like a dog trio, and the dog trio would kind of look like it had a hula skirts on or something from memory, I think, or had like extra hair. I don't know. It looks a bit like Hanson, I think. And then in this version, they have more kind of like steampunky and more kind of Knights of the Round Table style Pokemon as well. So do you remember like Farfetch'd?
That's a bird,
little
right?
duck with a leek.
Yeah.
So in this one, he can evolve into Surfetch'd, which means that his leek that he's holding turns into this big kind of jousting stick, which I thought was a sword, but then I looked it up and apparently it's a lance. And what you need to do to evolve your Farfetch'd into a Surfetch'd is that you need to get 3 critical hits in a battle. And apparently that's the same as what you need to do to win a jousting match. So it's kind of...
Oh, I
similar,
see.
Like that.
Very nice.
So that they've been quite clever with different like evolutions and different Pokemon they've introduced, and I thought that was really interesting.
Nintendo going, back to Zelda and Mario and other sort of, foundational stuff. They've always been so good at incorporating other like wider mythologies and kind of styles. And, I mean, if you look at, Mario, you've got this bizarre kind of almost like surreal imagery of like the modern age and pipes and everything coexisting with like things from Japanese mythology, like the Tanuki suit, and becoming a statue powers, and it's really... It's always been quite fertile and quite a strange collage of everything, everything that pops into the designer's myriad minds.
There's always that Egyptian tomb bit, isn't there, as well, all the dungeons and things, and it's all castles and
the environment dictating the level types. That's definitely something that you saw going all the way from the 2D stuff and into the top-down exploration era into the 3D games. I just wanted to, before we moved on, I just wanted to say I think you've got a good friend, haven't you, who's got the other one, Pokemon Sword, right? And you've been doing some swaps, right?
Yeah, shouts out to Olivia, who's been supplying me with Pokemon through the battle links or the link online. So I think it's much easier than ever to catch all the Pokemon through links with people that you either know, or you can trade with random people and get a random Pokemon from a different place. So that's quite exciting. And you can also in the newest ones, the newest kind of I don't know, pull factor is that you have your Pokemon, but some Pokemon in gyms and things can do this thing called Dynamaxing, so they'll just become enormous, kind of like what they do in what was the game that you mentioned that you had, like the battle one?
Oh, Pokemon Stadium.
Stadium, yeah.
Yeah.
So in this one, basically, the Pokemon become like, I don't know, 100 times bigger than you when you're standing there in the gym. And they'll kind of fight like that for 3 turns, and then they'll go back to their original sizes. And there's the whole storyline is based around the power of Pokemon becoming too big and too powerful. And yeah.
That's interesting, because it's almost the one thing it's not, or despite monsters battling being a part of it from the start, the one thing they're not really directly engaging with is the sort of kaiju visuals and, you know, making it about, and I suppose Jurassic Park as well. We were talking before about the appeal of, you know, seeing monsters wander around their natural environments, or, you know, like reservations, you know, and the sort of grandeur of it, you know. I mean, I suppose that's another thing that the series is now graphically ready to do and allow you to experience that kind of awe, you know. Yeah,
no, absolutely. It's a very good comparison, actually, because like the first scene when you come to Jurassic Park, all that famous theme music, and you see the T-Rexes running around on all the pterodactyls in the air, and it's stunning, isn't it? Like you're just like, wow, I've come to this island and there's all these beasts here, and it's where they live, and it's how they interact. And yeah, it's very much like that in the new games. You can see all these Pokemon just wandering through, or flying around, or kind of popping up underground and running away and things. So yeah, it's a fantastic experience.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. I promise you, at some stage I will get a Switch, and we will at the very least play Mario Party. I can't make any promises about Pokemon Shield, but yeah, that's great. Well, thanks for talking me through it. I'm gonna take a short break now and play some music, and then we'll return, and I'm sure we'll bring up Pokemon again, actually, because some of this stuff that we talk about in the second half is going to be evocative, or at least linked to some of the mythological traditions we've mentioned. But yeah, we'll get into that after the break. See you guys soon.
Welcome back to the EscapeGoat podcast. I am joined by David, and David's going to talk to us about Monsters in My Pocket. What kind of appealed to you about Monsters in My Pocket, and how did you get into that?
It's weird when someone else does the intro to the podcast, the welcome back. It really is. It's strange.
I hope you felt very welcome.
Yes, I do. I feel very welcome.
To your own podcast.
Very welcome to this. Yeah, so Monster. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about this, Olivia, is it's kind of, although I knew a bit about Pokemon, it's not been such a central thing in my life. You know, not this has been a central thing in my life, but I think it's probably came at an equivalent stage of our childhoods, respectively, because I'm a little bit older than you, and this was a sort of early '90s phenomenon. So it's known as Monster in My Pocket, and it was basically launched by 2 executives at Mattel. You know, so it was hardly an underground sort of project, although it was quite an eccentric one, and it was, I think, launched in the US in 1990 and probably made its way to Europe and other parts of the world throughout 91, 92. Certainly the sort of the initial stage of it that I'm particularly interested in and talking about. So when in 1990 I was 5, and I was probably about 6 or 7 when I came across this at school. And it was similar to the way that you came across Pokemon in terms of the sort of the social element of it, the trading. Because Monster in My Pocket, at its root, kind of the core of it was these little collectible figures that you bought in these opaque packages that were kind of almost like fortune cookies. Like so you'd maybe get like 2-3 monsters in the same bag, but you couldn't be sure what you're getting. And you'd often, if you were getting serious about collecting them, you'd often get the same ones over and over again, or you'd maybe get a bag where only one of them was new and the other 2 were duplicates of the ones you already had, different colours maybe. That kind of thing. So you know, you could end up spending an awful lot on this kind of stuff. That was the element I came to. I think I was probably brought some of the newsagent after school. I was intrigued by them. I was already quite interested in kind of like a lot of kids are in monsters and creatures, and kind of from a fairly early stage. Obviously I had fairy tale books like anyone else. I remember being traumatized in early childhood by a Red Riding Hood picture book that I had, where there was a particularly it was really it's funny actually with me and my brother. We both have like these primal kind of scared by wolves kind of experiences, like pictorial depictions of wolves. With Matt, it was the Disney version of Peter and the Wolf, which is endearingly hilarious. With me, it was a picture of the big bad wolf when he's dressed up in grandma's clothes. I had like a Red Riding Hood picture, but where the wolf is, I think, peering out from a sort of sinister four-poster bed, but dressed as the old lady. So it's kind of, for an adult, it's ridiculous. But I think as a kid, he had big teeth, he had yellow eyes. It was kind of, it was a page I used to skip as a kid when I was learning to read, that kind of thing. Oh. So I've always been interested in monsters, and I think again I had that same kind of collecting instinct that you clearly had with Pokemon. So I when this franchise launched in Britain, and was targeted heavily at school kids in the early 90s, I really got into it, and I was fascinated by the variety of things, because I think perhaps even more so than Pokemon, you hear, and as we'll get into some of this, you have this wide variety of traditions of monsters, creatures, other cultural artifacts, all jammed into this one series. We'll be talking primarily about series 1, which has 48 monsters in it. We won't be going through them one by one, but there are certain interesting trends and classifications in here. But yeah, I think I was fascinated by it then. I've never quite forgotten about it, and like you with Pokemon, it's been a bit of a lockdown rediscovery of mine. So yeah, that's kind of where I am with it.
Okay, yeah, because can you battle with your monsters, or is it just collecting?
Yeah, so it's so funny you asked that, because that was something I was a bit confused about as a kid, because obviously you come to these things differently socially. The monsters all have, in this first series, they all have number rankings from 5 to 25 point monsters, 25 point monsters, 20 point monsters, 15 point monsters, and so on, and they kind of go down like that. I think that there was meant to be a battle element of it, which I never quite grasped, and it was partly because although I traded these and collected them, I didn't really. I think it was maybe one of my friends who was of primary school had the board game, which I think is the structure in which they're meant to battle. And actually, we talk about battling environments. That has. I was looking into this because I never owned it and kind of coveted it at the time when I came across it at parties and stuff. They had like a desert environment, I think like a city environment, an ice environment, and apparently the monsters all had different secondary characteristics that would allow them to be powerful in those environments. But I think there were cards in the game as well, and it was kind of that. I think to the extent you were meant to battle them, that was it. I think you could probably do a blind draw thing, I guess, with them. You could maybe like put your hands behind your back, just pull one out, and it would be like if it was worth more points than the opponents, you'd win it, that kind of thing. I think I remember some of that going on in the playground. But no, I mean, for me, it wasn't exactly a solitary hobby, but I think it was probably a bit more antisocial than yours. Like I collected these, I've pored over them, I was fascinated by them, and I kind in hoarded them.
Yeah.
Like a Smaug's hoard of them. That sort of built up.
Precious.
And yeah, exactly. And I never actually had in series 1. I never actually had all of them. I got fairly close, I think, based on what I discovered earlier this year in my mum's attic. But yeah, no, I didn't really battle them so much. I read up about them, and I suppose also used them as launch pads into learning more about the kind of traditions and literature around them as well.
Because these monsters are all actually based on real myths and legends, as opposed to Pokemon, which are kind of completely made up, but loosely based on, like, they're all imaginary, but they are kind of semi-linked to real animals or myths and things. Whereas these beasts are actually, like, they belong to myths and reality to an extent.
Yeah, I suppose that it's interesting, actually, isn't it? Because we talk about this as these as two separate corporate juggernauts. All these monsters in Monster in My Pocket could probably not be owned to the same extent by Mattel, although obviously they were as product, and we'll see some of that in the branding. But most of them are drawn from public domain, I guess you'd say, kind of global myths, particularly European myths. We'll get into that, but they are things that are not in copyright in that extent, by and large, and where they're clearly inspired by copyrighted things, they've clearly dodged that. They've drawn on some copyrighted imagery, shall we say, without quite. And they've obviously had their lawyers look into what the most they can reference these things are without actually getting sued.
Sneaky.
In fact, there's a couple of baffling elements of that, actually, as we'll go through them. But I mean, do you want me to sort of, for people who might not be familiar with Monster in My Pocket in its original iteration, do you want me to sort of break down kind of roughly what these are, like where they're coming from?
Yeah. So start with the kind of I guess like the same iterations, like like you've Pokemon's got its cards and it's got its games and it's got its like kind of board gamey thing and stuff like that. What similarities does Monsters in My Pocket have? I know you've got the collectibles and you've also got like a sticker album, but beyond that, I'm not really sure. I know it's got the same kind of generation thing, but you've got series instead. So maybe touch on that a bit.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, well, as you say, it was a real franchise and a real juggernaut. Coming from the States in this case instead of Japan. But and part of the reason Pokemon went to the West, went to the US and Europe with its original Japanese name, portmanteau name of Pokemon, and didn't turn into something generic sounding like Pocket Monsters, was basically because Monster in My Pocket already had a big enough cultural imprint for that to be confusing to the Western market. So the reason Pokemon is known globally as Pokemon is probably largely down to Monster in My Pocket. It was a real thing. It had the sort of rubber collectible figures were at the start of it. These are all like small, like maybe like 1.5 inch figures, by and large. That they were there. There were trading cards. There were, as you say, collectible stickers. You had the sticker album to house them. I never owned the sticker album originally. Again, was fascinated by it as friends, and then bought it recently online during lockdown for what I can only describe as a ludicrous price, which I'm not going to share with our listeners.
Nobody's judging. It's fine.
Yeah, you should. You definitely should. But that was just, that's the most silly thing I've bought in the whole of lockdown. As I say, I've turfed out some of my old figures as well and rediscovered them. But yeah, there was a video game. There was at least a NES video game. And I think that was available for things like the Amiga as well, perhaps the Mega Drive. I never really played that. I was sort of discovering computer games around that time, but we didn't have some of the consoles to start with. We had some of the more sort of esoteric kind of Amiga games. But there was apparently a game where they grouped two of these. I think they kind of turned it into a kind of battle of good and evil, which when you see the variety of the monsters involved, you'll realise how kind of shoehorned that is. I think they had like the opposing armies of vampire and warlock going against each other in this sort of like struggle for supremacy. And they had a sort of plot about them being miniaturized, and all kind of like, sort of like a fig leaf to how ridiculous this whole thing was. But so it's a whole thing. There was a cartoon, apparently not very well received cartoon, which you can find on sites like Dailymotion.
Have you watched it?
I watched a bit of it. Yeah, it is ridiculous. I think that
yeah, is it bad or?
Yeah, well, the monsters get miniaturized and then they go to live in LA with some girl and like they're having like adventures. It's it's better than Entourage. I'll give it that. But yeah.
This is like if Snow White lived in LA and had loads of like mythical beasts around her instead of like birds from the forest and things. Is that what it would be like?
It's kind of a little bit like that, actually. Yeah, or kind of like a more malevolent Toy Story where there's like a sort of dark version of the toys, which is trying to like undermine human society and stuff. Yeah, it sounds pretty. I'm probably making it sound better than it actually is.
I kind of really want to watch it now. So sounds great. I mean, but you're more of a kind of how many series were there? Like 5 series or so? Yeah.
So this is where I get a bit confused very quickly because I was largely into series 1 and and series 2 as I understood it then and as it appears to have been was kind of an afterthought. It was not an afterthought, but an appendix, basically, because of the popularity of season 1. It was almost like how many more monsters and mythological things haven't we mentioned in series 1? And it was shorter, I think, as opposed to the 48. There was something like 20 or something in series 2. So I had quite a few of those, and indeed when I was looking up my old collection there were quite a few of series 2 knocking about in that. What must have happened after that is I soon lost interest because I believe they got, for reasons we'll discuss actually, which is quite interesting, they leaned away from popular mythological and religious kind of symbolism and they started doing just things like dinosaurs and bugs and creepy crawlies and then I think I think they ended up doing like wrestlers or something, which I think the purists of the series, of which I'm not one, I should say. I'm just interested in it, casually. They really scorn those later iterations, but yeah. So I was basically into it for the initial stage and like basically the second stage, but yeah, I mean it sort of petered out by the mid-90s. I think it kind of it had its sort of brief moment in the sun and then faded away, and I think they did just run into that sort of exhaustion as well. In fact, I'd say by the end of series 2, because it's only really series 1 and 2 that kind of are the same sort of thing, really, that they are definitely running into some, should we say, interesting choices as they scrape the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people feel like that way about Pokemon as well. I think towards even in this generation, but previous generations as well, it's like for example, like Pokemon Shield, there's literally a teacup and it's called Sinnis Tea, and you're like, wow. And there's like a lamp Pokemon, it's called like Lamp. I don't know what it's fucking called, but it's just like, you guys are just literally, we're like, oh, as a fan in the room, let's make a fan Pokemon. Or like, oh, there's a kind of, I don't know, a poster. Is there a bit of poster Pokemon? Maybe we could pull something out of that. Yeah.
Well, that's like Shoe in South Park, isn't it?
Yeah, and Towley, and you're like, wow, that's just a towel that talks. That's really cool, but not really. I think a lot of people feel like it started off being so imaginative and impressive, it just becomes like normal, and you're like, I didn't join this because it was, you know, based off objects in my house. I joined it because it has so much imagination. And so you love Series 1 and kind of Series 2. And I guess that's kind of what happened with me as well. Like, my Pokemon album is full of cards, mostly from the first generation, but all from the second, and it kind of just filters in. You get bits and pieces from both, and you don't really know how they got there or when the change was. But what are your like favorite monsters?
Yeah, well, let me for the listener break down a little bit, because what I did, just the sort of breadth of them, because I did a sort of weird exercise last night. So I took the monsters from Series 1 and I put them in a little spreadsheet, because this is the type of podcast this is.
The adult that you are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I didn't go nuts on it, but I just tried to group them all into kind of the geographically where they're from, and obviously most of them are fictional, so it's not right. There's one exception which we'll get into. Okay. But kind of the continent that they're from, just the continent, although there is some more specific geographical detail. And then I just tried to group them in. I tried to come up with like the basic categories that they are drawn from in terms of myth. So I think the categories I used were sort of, you know, generic mythology, you know, so I guess like oral tradition, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then more specifically modern, you know, texts like novels and other stories.
Mm-hmm.
And then things like religious texts, which obviously it's a fine line sometimes, but that actually turned out to be one of the most interesting kind of classifications. But just the sort of headline of that is I was breaking it down by continent, and even if some of this is up for debate obviously, but I tried to be as generous as possible with it, but 67% of the original 48 monsters, 36 by my count, are from Europe, you know, from a European tradition.
Oh, wow.
The rest could be, probably the largest minority is Asia beyond that, but about 23%. But really, by that, what you're really talking about is the Middle East and Persia, really. And in that, I'm including the Middle East as in, you know, Christian, Judaic tradition. So, you know, a lot of it's European and Asian, and there are some monsters there drawn from North America, Central America, none from South America that I noticed in that original 48, and there's some that could generously be termed as coming from African traditions, but all from kind of Saharan, Mediterranean, African traditions, Egypt, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's nothing
North
from
Africa.
Sub-Saharan Africa. No, nothing. Which actually I wanted to talk before we get into some of the oddities like exposed by this. I would say that one of the things Monster in My Pocket is, as much as Pokemon is for the late 90s, I guess, it's a kind of Western form of multiculturalism, essentially. And it's an often clumsy form of that, and it's directed at kids, it's simplified, it's boulderized. There's a lot of what you'd call problematic or offensive stuff in the sticker album alone, which I'll get to when we talk about some of the things on the list which arguably should not even be termed monsters.
Ruh-roh.
Yeah, Ruh-roh indeed. But I suppose in the same way that Pokemon for the later 90s is this non-Western attempt at this syncretism and, you know, combination and symbiosis of global mythology, Monster in My Pocket is definitely a often slightly clumsy but kind of endearing attempt by, I guess, like Western liberal society in the 90s to do that, you know, to combine all these things.
You must have learnt so much as a kid just about actual like mythology without really realising it, because you were just learning about all these monsters which do actually relate back to their cultures. Like I always struggle to you know, there's so much kind of Greek, Roman and Persian mythology out there, and it's so overwhelming to know where to start. Whereas when you have these monsters as a really good starting point, you're like, wow, this is from a country I've never been to, or like a continent I've never been to, and you just looking at the beast and what's written about it. It's really amazing, like how much you can learn, especially as a kid when you're absorbing all of this information about your favourite toy or whatever.
No, it's fascinating, and you get a lot of that stuff from sort of children's literature as well, and kind of, as I say, fairy tales. And, you know, me and my brother are talking about monsters. You know, me and my brother have talked before about how we had these sort of like Ladybird horror classics, which were basically adaptations of the novels in most cases, but like children's versions of Frankenstein, with much pared down text and loads of pictures, but that and Dracula, Hand of the Baskervilles, Dr. Jekyll, which we'll get onto because he's included here under a slightly different name. But yeah, that kind of thing, and I think it's actually, for me anyway, and probably for a lot of people, I've tended to almost like accidentally, semi-deliberately sidle into areas of knowledge like this a little bit. Like I've talked to you before about how my British geography growing up was pretty terrible, really. I mean, like I think in my defence, I never learned much of it systematically at school, but also kind of. I didn't really like sports, so I didn't really know where different cities were. I didn't really like cricket, so I didn't know where different counties were, that kind of thing. I knew a bit of Northern and Eastern Scottish geography, but that was about it. But because I'm a big politics nerd, over the last sort of 10 years, through knowing quite a bit about constituencies and electoral regions and federalism and that kind of thing, I've just kind of learned a lot of geography by osmosis. And obviously I've been to more places as well, and some of that deliberately because of politics. But so yeah, I suppose I've always learned by things partly accidentally, which I guess is how everyone learns.
What I think you should do is pick a constituency for every single monster in series 1.
Please don't encourage me to do things like that.
Oh, you will.
I will.
The idea is there. The seed is planted. It's too late.
Yeah, that Kraken looks like he's from Enfield North, landlocked though it is.
How did he get there?
Explains why he's so angry. Let me sort of explain to you, because I was saying before, sort of geographically where they came from. In terms of where they originate from, these monsters and the traditions, that the vast majority of them, I think it was 70% plus are from sort of folklore and oral tradition and things that we now consider without an author or without a known author, and that obviously can mean different things. And interestingly, 13% of them are from religious texts, which is about the same as they're from sort of contemporary novels and authored sources. As I say, I found the religious text ones the most interesting, and some parts of wider society found them the most interesting as well. It's notable that the first monster in the sequence, he's number one. He's one of the top ones. Is the Great Beast, and as a kid who didn't have much of a religious upbringing, I did go to Sunday school for a year and learn the sort of basic Bible stories, but someone who parents weren't religious or really at all, certainly not fervently. I didn't really know what this was, because it's a 7-headed dragon kind of creature that walks on its hind legs and has a lot of sort of fiery imagery in the sky behind it and stuff, and all the illustrations. And now this is the beast of Revelations, as some of our more religious listeners will know. It's straight out of the more apocalyptic, trippy, scary end of the world parts of the Bible, and to kick it off with that is such a strange choice.
It's a power move, if nothing else.
It's a real power move, because some of the second one is the Hydra, which you'll know from actual classical Greek mythology, but also from contemporary movies, fairly contemporary movies like Jason and the Argonauts, where the Hydra is almost like the primary antagonist, really, of that movie.
I actually know the Hydra mostly from playing the Hercules PS1 game, in which it took me so long as a kid to defeat the Hydra, and you have to crush each of its heads underneath a pillar, and eventually it gets crushed by one big rock. But apparently, according to legend, it's still actually alive. The Hydra is unbeatable and eternal, so you can't actually kill it. So it's just really angry and crashed under a rock forever.
That's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, I know. So just don't move that boulder.
Well, you mentioned the Disney version of Hercules. I think a few of the monsters on this list are things that Hercules encounters, because there's Cerberus as well, from Greek mythology, crops up, as well as things like Medusa. That was kind of Perseus's antagonist, wasn't it? So there's a lot, and I had illustrated Greek myths when I was a kid. So some of these things I'd be coming to not for the first time. Like that this was by no means my introduction to everything on this list.
Yeah.
I might as well get out of the way. One of the monsters is the Tyrannosaurus Rex, which I put down as from North America, because I believe historically they were.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
It's prehistorical.
Like Pangea or whatever.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So yeah, you're right. I think I remember. Certainly not my specialist subject, but I remember reading once that we'd only found since the mid-Victorian era, we've only really found what we think are 3 T-Rex skeletons, and obviously only none of them are complete. It's all extrapolation and.
Yeah, because most of them are plaster and just in museums, and you go up to them and they say this is a recreation of of the one that we have or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And but I think I might be wrong in this, but I think all of the ones we found were found in the fossil record of what's now North America. I think.
Wow.
But
didn't know that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, please correct me on that. get
I can't, so I won't.
no, but listeners, I'll get into some of the religious text ones in a minute, but some of the more, I suppose, like recognizable from the movies, that kind of to contemporary audience, monsters in here are from novels, although they tend to be from sort of Victorian, mid or late Victorian novels. But they are things like Frankenstein's monster, which is here on the list as actually being an authored text and has some elements of the kind of universal iconography in it. But they've obviously, as I was mentioning, they've changed enough to allow them to own at least this version of the figure. You've got he's listed as the Phantom here, who's clearly the Phantom of the Opera from the Gaston Leroux novel, 1910. You've got the guy who's stood there, in the illustration with because in most cases in the sticker album, the main illustration of these monsters corresponds very closely to what the rubber figure is, so you've got these like little mini statues of the monsters. You've got the mad scientist who is clearly Dr. Jekyll, and actually what surprised me was they refer to him in the sticker album in the sort of ancillary materials as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so it's not like they couldn't use the name. I don't know if they just thought Dr. Jekyll was a really uncool name for a monster, without getting into the details of it. But then you've got the I guess the other notable ones are you've got the Invisible Man from the H.G. Wells novel, and you've got he's just labelled here as Hunchback from the Victor Hugo novel from the 1830s. So we'll get into in a bit. We'll get into the monsters on this list, which could be considered problematic. He's one. He's one. Although to be fair, Victor Hugo started it.
Yeah. So, and going back to my question about which one is your favourite.
Well, I was I liked loads of them from a design perspective, I guess you'd say, as a kid. I thought loads of them looked cool, and some of them actually looked pretty scary. Like we'll talk a bit about the Hanover in a minute, but the Hanover's kind of this, as portrayed in this series anyway, as this sort of, I think it's shown as living on beaches and in the waves, but at the shore. But it's this sort of giant head, really, with like these weird frills and huge rows of teeth, and it's just this gaping maw thing that devours people. I thought that looked creepy even just as the rubber figure. It was quite intimidating and not like anything I'd seen. I really liked the Great Beast, as I say, not because of its slight religious weirdness, which I think I knew kind of where the traditions it was orbiting around, but it was quite mysterious to me. But I liked that partly because it was the most powerful, but also because I owned it quite briefly, because I lost it at primary school when I took my outfit for a split second, and I suspect I know which boy stole it, and I will never be able to prove it, and it doesn't rankle me at all. I'm over it.
You've been thinking about it for 20 years.
20 plus years. Yeah.
No, we're not going to name and shame on this podcast, are we?
No, definitely not. No, they're a prominent public figure now, and I won't go into that. I'll just keep it in my back pocket. But I do now own a model of that again, which I'm really grateful for.
Amazing.
But yeah, let me talk about some of the religious figures in this highlighted, because this actually got them into a bit of trouble at the time. I'll put this information in the show notes, but there was actually an incident. Well, not an incident, but there was a social sort of backlash to Monster in My Pocket, particularly in the UK, actually, because of, I think, largely because of the sort of probably slightly more sort of established presence of a Hindu community in the UK in the early 90s. So what they did is, in series one of the monsters that they chose was the goddess Kali, who I think is the consort of Vishnu, isn't she, in the sort of Hindu tradition? And by portraying her as a monster, and I can tell you in the photo album, in the sticker album rather, the portrayal of her is not flattering. It contains many weird Orientalist stereotypes. There's a lot of kind of ridiculous kind of stuff. Obviously, she looks scary. She's shown as engaging in very villainous activity. It's definitely playing into a lot of the kind of in Indian phobic kind of imperialist traditions that you'll also see manifested in things like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which also to an extent relate around Kali, perverse Kali worship, and things like Around the World in 80 Days as well. I think they've got a sequence in that where Phileas Fogg rescues a sort of damsel in distress from a sacrifice to Kali. Obviously, sacrifice to gods is the thing that happened, but the Kali kind of cult, as it would have been seen by a lot of the British, was particularly vulnerable, I think, historically to some of these sort of calumnies and misrepresentations. So this is where you see these kind of like old imperialist attitudes and otherizations, Orientalism manifesting in sort of what was meant to be a kind of harmless bit of fun and education for kids. And the British Hindu community, or at least some members of it, were not happy. There were protests. The Mattel was picketed, and letters were written, particularly by the group Vishva Hindu Parishad. And they doubled down on this in the second series when they featured Ganesha as well, as a further manifestation of Hindu polytheism, which I think eventually these monsters were sort of retroactively recalled. I think Kali was maybe repackaged as multi-armed goddess in some of them, which seems to be just making it worse.
Just insult to injury.
Yeah, it's very strange, odd decision. But yeah, I mean, some of them are really fascinating, because especially the ones. There's a fine line between mythology and religious texts, but some of the more global ones, and by that I mean non-European ones, where they've reached out to parts of the New World for traditions and stuff. They're really interesting. There's one which I was really interested by as a kid called Coatlicue. I think it might be Coatlicue. I should have looked that up, but it's an Aztec goddess basically, which looks to me quite horrifying, because it's a sort of two-headed beast, sort of almost like lizard-looking beast, conjoined, sort of hissing at the audience and stuff like that, and it's got like loads of Aztec imagery for kids in the background, step pyramids, that kind of thing. But Coatlicue was specifically a goddess of women who died in childbirth in Aztec culture. Oh. So you can see how it might be associated with horrific imagery and devouring imagery and things like that. But that's a real deep pull, isn't it? That's I'm sure what it was is they were just looking for the most exotic looking thing from Central American mythology.
Yeah.
But I had no idea about any of that background then, and any idea how interesting it was. It led me down a bit of a Wikipedia rabbit hole when I was looking into it the other night. But yeah, you've got Kali, as I said before, the aforementioned Kali. You've got looking down the list. You've got borderline religious texts like Charon, the ferryman who ferries the Greek sort of honoured dead into Hades, and you've got things like the Behemoth, the Behemoth. I've never quite known how to pronounce that.
I think it's
from
Behemoth,
the Behemoth, who comes from sort of I guess kind of very old traditions of sort of the Torah and and sort of very early Christian texts as this sort of hippopotamus-like beast. Again, here you've got the kind of exoticization of parts of the near Asia and North Africa. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that's very interestingly combined from different traditions, and as I say, could be seen as extremely problematic. There's one that I actually found it hard to get to the bottom of. I only did a little bit of research on this over the last week, but one just seemed to be pretty obscure to me, or pretty opaque, and this is Karnak. This is also one of the ones I had as coming from Africa, because Karnak is portrayed as this kind of like very to a kid that it look notably Egyptian. It's got a kind of pharaoh style headdress on, but it seems to be sort of, it's not Anubis, but it seems to have a sort of it's long and emaciated, and it's bipedal, and it's got two skulls in its hand, and the skulls in the literature attached to it have these magical powers. I couldn't find a Karnak exactly. I've heard the term Karnak to be used as a sort of like fake exotic mind reader name. I think it was by Johnny Carson in the States. But the nearest I could find, obviously, Karnak is a historical ruins site in Egypt near Luxor, and it appears that Luxor was associated with worship of the I think Amun originally, which sort of became this Egyptian central sun deity when combined with Ra, so Amun-Ra, who you probably heard mentioned. I think Karnak's kind of meant to be a monsterization of that, but if so, they've done such a good job on it that I can't connect it back to the original, except for it being named after the site. So it's almost like someone at Mattel just went on holiday, and just thought, that's cool, that's a cool name, and this is a spooky place, so we're throwing that in.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's like a temple of Karnak or something. That I think I've been to the temple of Karnak, or I've been to Luxor definitely, but I don't recognize it as a monster either. It does look like it's a headdress kind of beast. Does it not like it's like an underworld beast, is that right? I read a brief description of some of the Monster in My Pocket ones. He kind of destroys temples, is that right? Yeah,
that's right. And I think he has mind control powers attached to the skulls. Yeah, I mean, it's all kind of linked to things that are genuinely sinister about mythology and religious traditions, and they've clearly done a bit of their job there.
You think they made that one up, like, on... Is that the only kind of original, let's say, like, monster in my pocket that's not based on something...
Well, I wouldn't like to make that bold a claim, but there's it's certainly the only one I couldn't find a direct link, apart from maybe, as I say, that sort of exotic fetishization to a real text or a real sort of tradition. If you go the other way, there's a few things in this which are so generic in terms of cultural settings that they could be seen as accurately global. Like I've got down the ghost here as something that you can't really pin down to any one tradition. Although it's interesting that their version of the ghost pictorially is kind of he looks a bit like Munch's The Scream, but he also looks like a Halloween ghost. Like they specifically talk about him in the sticker album as wearing a sheet because he's invisible otherwise. So he looks like a kid playing Halloween, And they've also got actually I found this really interesting, given that on a recent episode of this podcast we talked about Roald Dahl. They've got the gremlin in there, and he's specifically a modern bit of folklore, but he's also one that Roald Dahl, being an RAF pilot, popularised, because this is very much the gremlin of, messing about on planes and, jumping up and down the wings and taking them apart. And, of course, that was probably most popularised, even above Dahl, by the Twilight Zone episode. So this is the one that could be, the Twilight Zone is one of my favourite shows, for all its mixed results. So that's a really cool modern one, because that's one of the few monsters on this that really is drawn from indelibly from the modern world, he's a technological monster, basically.
I have a kind of link to what you mentioned about gremlins, and with something that I was looking up about the new Pokemon in the most recent Pokemon Shield game, and there's this Pokemon called, very uninventively, Impidimp, which is a dark fairy kind of imp Pokemon, which kind of feeds off negative energy in households and sneaks into things and like steals stuff and like just kind of generically mischievous. Same kind of goes back to like Germanic folklore, and apparently the one in the game, because it's going back to the UK reference of the map, this is meant to be based off like a Lincolnshire imp or Lincoln imp or something.
Okay.
And apparently there was like in Lincoln Cathedral, the devil surrounded by these two like imps was annoyed by the cathedral's completion for some reason, who knows why, and like visited it with two imps who like set about to destroy it. An angel came down and basically just kind of like banished one of them and petrified the other or something, and just turned them just got rid of these imps. But I had for something from the like.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so that's something I learned about that. But
there's a lot of stuff in the folklore around Monster in My Pocket that is both, you get these really generic monsters, which although they're maybe from a specific region and maybe their name, they're the kind of things you can find in all sorts of different folklore. Like you've got the Wendigo, who's this sort of cannibalistic monster from First Nation, I think like Nova Scotia, Wisconsin kind of mythology, right. Sort of Native American stuff, but he's got elements in common with, maybe your werewolves and, your kind of flesh-eating monsters like of that nature. You've got the Red Cap as another one, who's a sort of impish figure with a knife from the Scottish borders, who was actually associated with kind of sites of massacre and bloodshed, but we seem to be lurking around them like a kind of scavenger, ghoulishly. In fact, the ghoul is another one. You've got the zombie specifically on this list, who is he's portrayed visually as looking a bit like a sort of Romero zombie. Go back to our first episode, me and Matt talk a bit about that. But this one is specifically linked to the Haitian tradition, and the sort of symbiotic West African Caribbean tradition. So linked to voodoo essentially, and linked to the sort of revival of corpses by that specific magic. So you've got all sorts of weird combinations on this. But one of the most interesting I found about here is you've got Spring-Heeled Jack way down the list, who is he turns out, I mean, we could honestly do a whole podcast about the Spring-Heeled Jack tradition, but for anyone who doesn't know at all, loads to read into here, but like Spring-Heeled Jack was kind of an urban legend in the early Victorian period. In fact, I think he was first reported at the very start of the Victorian period, like 1837, late 1830s, and he was this kind of strange figure who was rumoured to be attacking people around British cities, and became this like big kind of tabloid, Penny Dreadful thing of this man who could kind of almost like comically like Spider-Man or something, like jump very high, and he was like seen to move around the cities and jump up buildings and all that sort of stuff, but he was also attacking women. And I think that seems to have gone throughout the Victorian era. The legend of Spring-Heeled Jack seemed to develop into this sort of almost like cultural hysteria, so they picked out some really interesting cuts here, as well as the kind of the better known stuff. There's a lot to unpack in here, an awful lot.
I have no idea about that.
Yeah, I mean, even just check out the Wikipedia entry for Spring Hill Jack. It's crazy.
I will.
Yeah.
Tell me more about the controversy of the different ones that you've discovered.
Yeah, well, it's so this wasn't so much a contemporary controversy, but if you're looking at it from an adult perspective, and as indeed from a 2020 perspective, you'd certainly take issue with the not just the presence of the Hunchback. Apart from anything else, they turn him into a much more villainous figure than the Hunchback. I suppose this is partly my late 90s Disney perception of the Hunchback of Notre Dame as being quite a fairly lovable figure. I know the version in the novel's a bit more hard-edged. But you've also got the Witch. This is where they go to generic wells of monsterdom and otherization, where you probably in 2020 wouldn't just shove something on there and call a witch a monster. Apart from anything else, the history of persecution of witchcraft and the terrible crimes that were perpetuated against mostly against women in European history and other parts of the world, and still are obviously in some parts of the world. You probably wouldn't just throw that in, put it that way.
So there's kind of like a weird mix of like monsters that are really banal, like don't really belong anywhere specifically, like ghosts and witches perhaps, and then you've got all these really specific, this belongs to that temple, and Kali belongs to kind of India. So there's a whole range of different. And in series 2, are there any ones that you remember which are kind of, I don't know, more memorable, or ones that you collected that you thought were kind of cool before they became a bit more generic? And
yeah, definitely. I mean, I was fascinated. Some of the designs in series 2, we don't even really have the time to get to it here, but I'll post a link to some of the, so people can have a look at the pictures themselves, because there's great artwork. I mean, like more fully realised in the sticker album and everything, but the little models are pretty detailed. And they're pretty, obviously very standardised and mass produced, but they're lovely little pieces of work. Stuff in series 2 includes I've got some in front of me here actually. I've got the Loch Ness Monster. There's a sort of living gargoyle creature. There's a lot of kind of, I think there's an ectoplasmic phantom who's this kind of like again quite generic ghost, but he's portrayed in this really sort of sludgy, gloopy kind of way. Looks like a sort of monstrous Mr. Man kind of figure. There's
Mr.
one.
Man. We'd watch that.
Yeah, totally. Getting kickstarted next year. There's something that looks like the kind of which sign of the zodiac is it? That's the sort of hunter. Is that Sagittarius?
Sagittarius, yeah.
Yeah, there's something I can't remember what they've assigned him to here, but that's what he looks like anyway. And there's sort of something that looks almost like one of the horses from the Guinness advert, like a sort of foaming horse beast, who I think some sort of Celtic tradition.
That is very specific. Well,
yeah,
like Kelpies,
yeah.
so. Kelpies, is that right?
Kelpie, yeah, it might be a Kelpie. Yeah, there's a dragon who looks like a dragon from the kind of more Western tradition. There's a Smaug-like dragon, rather than the sort of more Chinese dragon tradition.
Okay.
Yeah, but
that's pretty cool.
I mean, they are fascinating. Oh, the Minotaur. The Minotaur is another one in that second series. But yeah, they continue certainly in that second series. They continue to be drawn almost from a comically wide variety of kind of traditions, and yeah, it's really fascinating watching them all interact and everything. One of the most interesting things I found out in this little research journey was one of the ones that's not really attributable. Do you remember I said before I was really impressed by how scary the Hanover looked?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one with just like a head. Yeah,
the one that's like a beach-bound head. So that turns out to be weirder than either. Obviously, the T-Rex is real, from research, and all the others are a mixture of fears and influences and tradition. The Hanover's really unique because that wasn't really a thing. It was a marketing gimmick. It was a sort of, I think, 17th century. The sort of in Britain, sort of Tudor, Stuart, Georgian tradition of cobbling together monstrosities and displaying them in museums and freak shows, and you'd get like mermaids made out of a monkey stitched to a fish and things like that. And the Hanover seems to have been made out of like weird bits of like semi-exotic fish stitched together, and it was known more as the Jenny Hanover. But they seem to have made a sort of particularly monstrous version of this for this series, but kind of acknowledged that tradition of fake exhibitionism, and that kind of, obviously that kind of, you kind of get at the root of some of this here, don't you? Because Europe in particular, with its sort of role for centuries of global economic primacy, has always kind of othered traditions from the rest of the world, and it's part of that has been the monsterization of the unknown, the sort of traditional here be dragons thing. I mean, some of these descriptions of these non-European monsters, even if you're just coming from ancient Greece, go back as far as the Iliad, and the sort of Homeric tradition. But you've also got some of that. I think one of these was, who was it? The Catoblepas. Catoblepas? That's almost certainly wrong.
Catoblepas?
But it's
who knows?
I think it's described as a sort of African Plains version of the Gorgon. You know, I think that's where I read it. You know, so it's monstrous and it can turn people to stone and it poisons the earth. That was described as living in Ethiopia, partly from local traditions, but also by people going way back to Pliny the Elder. And Leonardo da Vinci mentioned it in his notebooks as a thing that he'd read about in his, you know, like merchants that he talked to, you know, local storytellers. So, you know, a lot of this stuff's, you know, just from this fascinating tradition of misreporting, essentially, of fake news, you know, of these global traditions and folklores that are barely understood when they get to the other end of the earth. And that's something nice that links it to our Pokemon discussion, really, because, you know, again, you're seeing Pokemon's one of the big products of globalization, you know, commercially, but also culturally. And you see different parts of the earth sort of trying to understand, sell to, and speak to each other, really, don't you?
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. I was actually going to say I have a book called The Book of Imaginary Beings, which is by Jorge Luis Borges, and the Catobelpas, we'll never figure out how to say it,
No.
but it's in this. But it has a really interesting description of which is actually written in first person, as if the Catobelpas is describing itself.
Wow.
Which is like, a beast downhearted, wary, I do nothing but feel under my belly the warm mud. My head is so heavy that I cannot bear its weight. I wind it slowly around my body with half-open jaws. I pull with my tongue poisonous plants dampened by my breath. Once I ate up my forelegs unawares. It's just like, wow, what a beast.
Yeah. Can relate, hard relate.
Can relate, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, yeah, I mean, well, it draws on those, you know, because Borges there is playing with the old bestiaries, isn't he? Like in the medieval almanacs of such things, which were very popular, you know, like especially when, you know, print became more popular, you know, because people were fascinated, you know, people, just as we have been in our generations, you know, people are fascinated by monsters and that collector's nature and, you know, the kind of weird sort of paranormal zoology that they are, you know, that they involve. It's funny actually as well, because I've kind of finished cataloguing these now, really, but like for the benefit of the podcast anyway, but going right back to Pokemon and its roots, one of the monsters in this series one is the Tengu, which I think is billed in the Sticker albums being Japan's most famous monster, but it's obviously it's all from Shintoism.
He obviously won that like competition that was held that he was the most famous one of all, like Miss Monster of the World. Or something.
We all remember that. Yeah, televised. But yeah, the Tengu's, you know, from Shinto tradition as well. You know, it was a sort of a heavenly sentinel. It's referred to in places that, you know, the sort of humanoid birds of prey. They're associated with like areas of like war, you know, but also volcanoes and mountainous regions of Japan. They crop up in Hindu, Buddhist, Jain mythology. You know, they're really you know, they're from a really rich seam, and that, you know, as you say, even for me as a kid to just get this flavour of Japanese mythology, I suppose at that age, even just to understand that the Japanese had a distinct mythology, you know, is kind of, it's interesting, you know, and it's not the kind of thing you'd get necessarily at all stages of human history, where you'd kind of have even that very base knowledge, and, you know, it's a great foundation, I think.
No, that's true, because in primary school you kind of, you know, historically learn about like Egyptians and Aztecs and you know, Romans and Greeks and stuff, but it's usually quite, I don't know, like Eurocentric, I guess, as most things kind of tend to be, or kind of branching out to Egypt, because that's just, Egypt's like a whole thing on its own. But yeah, I don't remember learning about Japanese history in primary school necessarily, or like not at all like the myths and legends of it. So yeah, it must have been pretty eye-opening. Yeah,
it's you know, as someone in later life, you know, not only did I get kind of interested in sort of a very introductory level of religious education and sort of a little bit of religious philosophy at university, very basic level, but you know, it was a good foundation for that. You know, I remember as long ago as primary school, we'd have, you know, I had quite a multicultural, multi-ethnic primary school for South Manchester, you know, and we had like, you know, Diwali assemblies, you know, where I remember learning about Hanuman and things like that. Actually, Hanuman crops up in one of the later Monster in My Pocket situations.
Oh, really?
So that's some more annoying the Hindu community. Great. But I also like, you know, my interest in monsters continued beyond this and into film fandom, you know, as well, because, you know, you've heard me and Matt and my other friends rhapsodize about the Alien series, you know, and the sort of design of the alien by Geiger, you know, and that's right, you know, I mean, if you have a childhood fascination with monsters, it almost terminates at the Alien, doesn't it? You know, it certainly did for me. It not terminates, but kind of that's almost the apotheosis of this kind of synthesism, isn't it? Because the Alien, the xenomorph, as people call it, you know, like takes influences from different traditions and fears and fuses them together in this modern nightmare creature that has elements of real biology and real tradition, and but also the darkest corners of Geiger's fevered imagination, and puts it in this modern industrial setting. And you can see for me how a childhood priming in this kind of stuff led to a later fandom of those films.
So is the alien like the great beast of adulthood?
Yeah, I guess if you were making something out of filmic influences and filmic iconography, you'd probably put that somewhere near the top, wouldn't you? It'd be one of the top tier.
Yeah.
Both in terms of just a little reproducible statue that you could make for kids that would look cool, but also just so as a design. I mean, people have talked about this a lot, but the alien, Geiger's alien as a design thing is just one of the great designs, like of the 20th century, I would say.
Oh yeah.
And
definitely. No.
And I think it will be enduring as well. Like I think obviously we can't really predict how human culture is going to adapt and evolve, but I can see long after the films are maybe lost and forgotten, I can see the iconography of the alien persisting, because it's so relatively simple but so beautiful.
Are there any monsters in the series, like they're all from this planet essentially, or from people who believed in them in this planet, but there aren't any from outer space, right?
I think they again, that might be something they got into in a later series, not that I'm aware of, but again, I'll look into that, because I wonder if they were sort of generic, bug-eyed monster, grey kind of descriptions, or if they, again, the more you get into sort of modern sci-fi representations, the more you'd be scratching up against things that have like very clear copyright owners, wouldn't you? So unless you were just going to make 24 alien species out of plain cloth, you'd basically be infringing a lot, or at least risking lawsuits, even so that's probably a reason not to go for that.
And you mentioned like I just mentioned about getting Pokemon Shield and kind of giving into my, going back to my childhood and retreating into lockdown with something that gives me comfort. How has it helped you through the last few months to kind of start recollecting and to buy an expensive sticker album that's complete?
It was nice. It was it was really a lovely thing to get when that came in the post, because I loved looking through it, and it's all complete, so I mean the stickers were, so that's not a thing that it's gonna. It was a one-off thing in that aspect of it, at least, so I'm not going to be like go on this wild quest to get all these stickers, which would have, I think, felt almost too childish.
That would be pretty outrageous.
Yeah, too indulgent, but having it as this completed artifact and be able to leaf through it, and it is this sort of complete Pokédex now, and the figures that I have are on the side. I've talked about maybe getting, because I've probably owned about half of Series 1 at the moment. I've been thinking about ordering some online. They can range to quite expensive, so it's how ridiculous I want to get, or how staggered I want to get with the pay packets over the next few months. But yeah, I'm thinking about collecting the rest of them, and the sticker albums brought me great joy, and it's such a fascinating piece of like early 90s childhood product basically as well. It's just, aesthetically it's ridiculous, because like the illustrations in it are partly artful, but they're also partly kind of Beano levels, cartoonish, and the captioning and the way they presented these monsters' backstory to kids, as I say, in a often amusing, sometimes a borderline offensive way. It's great. It's really interesting. I think I love when I get a bit older, and I'm a bit older now. I like looking back to my childhood and working out how I took in this knowledge first and these influences, and what that looked like, because your memories get less reliable, and it actually helps to get a physical artifact and just go, yeah, these were like this, this is how I saw them.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I have a question for you. Is there a monster that you think is missing, or a monster that you think that you would add to a series or to your collection that isn't already there?
Oh, that's a really good one. I mean, a lot of the foundational ones, as I say, even if they don't take on like the film forms or the more iconic film forms, are there. So you've got the werewolf and you've got the vampire, who isn't called Dracula in this, but he seems visually, he's kind of like almost like a combination of all the more iconic vampires. He's got elements of Nosferatu and Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee in there, in the little statue. I mean, you would have to get into that sort of modern monster movie iconography, I think, because they've got the ghost here, it's a quite generic ghost, but you'd probably have things like, Sadako from The Ring, and you'd have the Xenomorph, as I say, and the Predator, and you'd have more recent things like that. You probably have the Babadook. Let's throw the Babadook in there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Who is apparently a gay icon, right?
Oh, that's one of my favourite things about our century, is that he is somehow a gay icon. I've never got tired of whatever that was.
Amazing.
Yeah. No, but yeah. So I'd have some additions, but they are probably. We'll see what happens with copyright in the next 50 years, because they will be at the moment would not be sensible additions to a future form of this.
I love it.
So yeah, we really got into the weeds of that, didn't we? I think that was really a really fascinating look at those different franchises, because I think they're kind of they existed side by side in the 90s, and one kind of succeeded the other, but they're really interesting fusions of a whole bunch of different stuff. And thanks for joining me to have a look at that. Thank you. That was great.
No, thank you. And yeah, I mean, despite the kind of similarities and differences, and despite that they apparently was it what the people who created some of them tried to sue Nintendo over claims that Pokemon infringed on Monster in My Pocket, I think, at some point.
Oh, I'm sure there was a bit of that.
Yeah. No, they are fundamental parts of our childhood and who we are and how we see monsters and understand the world and learn to love beasts and nature and the planet that we live on, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's definitely part of it. And you know, the full oddity of the planet we live on as well, you know, because not just geographically, environmentally, but, you know, culturally, just how crazy a lot of the stories we tell each other are, and how much you can tweak them and adopt them, you know.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah, not at all. No, my absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining us again, and thanks for joining us for this second time as well. And I hope to have you back on the podcast in the future to talk about something else.
Yeah, sounds fab. Great,
fantastic. Well, that was the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 13, and that's goodbye from my guest Olivia.
Bye.
And goodbye from me. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Blake Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications, or get me personally on @dbfagiani. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.
Charmeleon.
There you go.
It's called Charmeleon.
There you go.
Fuck.